All right, there we go. And we're back. Yeah, we'll see what happens. See if we can't get people in here. Are you smashing buttons? Hell yeah, smash them. Get it, bro. Now we're gonna add pilled. See what happens there. All right, in that afternoon libertarian vibe. What up, Rumble? How we doing, everybody? Okay, we're seeing right now. What we're doing is, hi, how's it going? Welcome to the show. We'll get started here in a second. Right now, we're just kind of chilling, but we're doing some little afternoon stuff, see what we can see for audience. And right now we're trying to get pilled hooked in here. So then we'll get all of it. Hell yeah, what up, guys? I think we're gonna get rid of Trovo for this one. We'll add a channel. Custom. Okay, so
we're no longer welcome in the jungle.
I mean, we're still welcome in the jungle. I just we haven't had any watchers on Trovo at all. Like, it's weird. Like, so on Restream, this program I use, it tells you like how many people are watching and where. And we never have any watchers on Trovo ever. Which is weird. I mean, like, even on D Live, there's a few that pop in here and there, you know? Which is fine. The main question is, can we get pilled to work with this? So... and the answer is I don't know, but it'd be really funny if we could. So, add new channel. There we go. Okay. So then we can pop out. See what this does. Streaming. It says it's working. We'll know in about 2 minutes when the video catches up, right? I have an arch enemy? Crazy. Okay. So. Says we're live. There it is. We're live on Pilled. We did it. Okay. Is there a way to get all the chats up from the different platforms? Yeah, well, I'm gonna get it on screen here in a second. Well, so I can't get Pilled and I can't get Rumble, but I can do all the other ones like this. I did not know Lady Liberty is actually male. Okay, so we got that. Now we just got to pop out Rumble so we can talk to those guys. What up, Rumble? I don't know how to pop out their chat. There might not be a way to. Oh well. Okay. Let's see if this works. Hi. Do the stickers work? Yes. Okay. And we're just about good to go. I arch enemy as you have more viewers on my radio show. Oh. Oh no. Oh no. Ah. All right. There we go. And I think there should be perfect now. Now the calls are armed. Everything's up and running. We can do it. Let's do it. that do it? It did. Nice. All right, so we're gonna watch some libertarian propaganda today, baby. Let's start out with some Lanny Friedlander.
Successful opinion magazines are often launched by successful people. The New Republic was co-founded by the famous progressive intellectual Walter Lippmann. National Review was launched by the best-selling author William F. Buckley. Reason, on the other hand, was the brainchild of a 20-year-old Boston University student who wrote in one of his early editor's notes, "I drive a delivery van for a living." Lanny Friedlander stapled together and mailed out the first mimeographed issues of Reason from a messy room in his mother's house in Brighton, Massachusetts. He would sell the fledgling magazine just 2 years later and slowly fade away. And yet, Lanny's blazing and influential vision still lives on, visible in Reason's lowercase sans serif logo, its sympathy for outsiders and dreamers, and in its hunch that technology, more than politics, is the driving force of human freedom.
Within a few years, there's going to be computers in many homes, and then eventually most homes. That means that you can have individualized news, because you can just say, I only want news about Spiro T. Agnew, or I don't want any news about Spiro T. Agnew.
Friedlander believed in gathering various strains of libertarianism under one roof for stimulating debate, and was committed to engaging with the best ideas of his political adversaries.
We would just discuss the structure of society and what we can do in the areas that we agree upon.
Lanny's mix of startling visual presentation and contrarian writing created an almost instant momentum,
What up, Carrie Lake? How are
tantalizing
you?
early readers and contributors alike with an infectious sense of unimagined possibilities. When Reason speaks of poverty, racism, the draft, the war, student power, politics, and other vital issues, it shall be reasons, not slogans, it gives for conclusions. Proof, not belligerent assertion. Logic, not legends. Coherence, not contradictions. This is our promise. This is the reason for Reason. So who was this disheveled visionary, and why did he flame out so fast? Upon Friedlander's death in 2011, Reason's Nick Gillespie wrote that he had started thinking of Lanny as libertarianism's answer to Syd Barrett, the mad genius founder of Pink Floyd, who got something great started and then couldn't or wouldn't live in the world he did so much to create. In reality, Lanny Friedlander was an objectivist who believed in big tent libertarianism, a student protester who reviled other student protesters, an anti-war, anti-draft activist who volunteered for the Navy. He was professionally charismatic and personally introverted, an exacting truth seeker and unreliable narrator, a systemic thinker and disorganized coordinator. The printed format of this issue, he wrote, does not represent a guarantee that the next issue will also be printed. Wired co-creator Louis Rossetto, who first encountered Reason as an undergrad at Columbia University, said in 2011 that the publication was my gateway to good design. Yet when describing his own self, Friedlander preferred the term writer-intellectual. That writing contained a breadth rarely seen among 20-somethings of any era. Friedlander argued persuasively that pollution is theft, and applied Austrian economics to the question of how the police would operate in a free society.
You tried.
At turns
John Lasseter,
theoretical
you
and
tried.
practical, pedantic and poetic, his voice vibrated with a visceral rage when touching on the dehumanization of modern institutions. Whatever reason a parent might have for leaving his children in the care of the state, he snarled in a piece about public schools, it will not diminish their intellectual death nor mitigate their emotional torture. As fate would cruelly have it, Friedlander spent much of the rest of his life institutionalized and chained to the dulling anchor of antipsychotic drugs, a diagnosed schizophrenic under the wary eye of the paternalistic state. But before his sad decline, there was a bracing boldness to venture somewhere new, starting with how Lanny's magazine would look. Visual elements that decades later would become faddish in art schools were there from the very beginning. Lanny was a fan of Massimo Vignelli, so Reason had a perfect Swiss grid, very clean and pure, lots of white space, ragged right, Helvetica-type conceptual illustrations, Rossetto recalled. Friedlander consumed the latest cutting-edge books and periodical graphic design from nearby MIT Press, including mail-order newsletters and zines, and of course, comic books. Reason, as early as 1969, published some original panels by legendary Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko. Reason was anti-establishment without being part of the new establishment, and without being either crank left or kook right, Rossetto recalled, and it had this bright, shiny optimism and unshakable faith in the triumph of good ideas. In 1968, Friedlander's writing confronted the burning issues of the moment: violence, war, race relations, campus upheaval, with boldly counterintuitive takes. It is the initiation or threat of initiation of physical force by the government that is the major cause of violence in America, he wrote. Both Jim Crow and minimum wage laws were unambiguous examples of racism, and the New Left and George Wallace had more in common than either would ever admit. Lanny was an odd duck, but always striking. He was a person of few words in conversation and always seemed to be somewhat detached or inward in his way, recalls Mark Frazier, who as a high school student helped with paste up and other tasks at the magazine. While the Libertarian movement was blooming in New York City in the early 1970s, Lanny was starting to wither, declining even to participate much when his protege, Louis Rossetto, invited him to come around the offices of Outlook, another influential, if short-lived, Libertarian publication. After that, there's a period where he just disappeared. The wheels started coming off more often. The mental illness that had plagued his mother appeared to be derailing a promising young career. Friedlander's final byline in the magazine he created came in October 1972, just shy of his 25th birthday. What came next were vague tales of troubled travels in the South, frantic calls for money, a drunk and disorderly misdemeanor conviction in Miami in 1975. Somewhere within that flailing period, Friedlander enlisted in the Navy, only to be discharged shortly thereafter on psychiatric grounds. So complete was Friedlander's break from his reason-founding past that even his own attorney didn't believe his friend's old war stories. Lanny was telling me that he was this great graphic artist and he started a magazine and everything. And of course, I'm thinking this was just the psychosis, you know? I was all incredulous. Reinforcing that skepticism was the one time that Lanny got anxious about losing his art portfolio. After a search, the missing satchel was discovered, and just like in A Beautiful Mind, the art was like third grade, Murphy says. It was basically gibberish. Back in 2008, when I was editing Reason, I asked my wife, who is a private investigator, to help track Friedlander down. Turns out he was in a veterans home in Lowell, Massachusetts. She inadvertently got him on the phone. "Is that you?" she said. "Yes," he responded. She told him that Reason wanted to connect.
What up, W.
and asked
Kirby?
if she could
Welcome.
pass along his number. After a long pause, he declined, sounding shell-shocked and wounded, though not quite mad. We arranged to have the magazine and related swag sent to him on a regular basis. Then, in December 2010, Reason science correspondent Ron Bailey got a handwritten letter in the mail in response to an article about genomics. "I think you should take your thinking one step further and write about the prospects for immortality in the foreseeable future," wrote a Mr. Lanny Friedlander.
If you're watching
"I also
over on
wonder if
Rumble, hit that
magicians
thumbs
can
up. That
reverse
really
the
helps.
effects
Thank you."
of old age." Then came the kicker. P.S. I started Reason magazine in 1968. Lanny died of a heart attack the following year at the age of 63. Lanny Friedlander did more than just start Reason. He willed into being a demonstration project that you don't need money and other built-in advantages to launch a worthwhile journal of opinion. He showed people who didn't even know it yet that they were entrepreneurs, journalists, futurists, and even libertarians.
Yeah.
But there was a different way of thinking and being in the world.
Yeah.
That one could be revolutionary even while advocating the most modest of policy gains. Before his productive brain betrayed him, he was consumed with a question that challenges all of us to this day. How do you make social change? In a world where there is no single right answer, how do we explore, maximize, and expand all the avenues for making the world a better place?
Not that theory isn't important, but this seems to be a movement primarily of philosopher kings. One person defined the libertarian movement as 800 people trading books. We had to change that.
One man can stop the motor of the world, Ayn Rand wrote in Atlas Shrugged. The opposite is also true. One man can start the motor, not just of one world, but of several. That, in the end, is the legacy of Lanny Friedlander.
All right. I just wanted to start with just I think when we're going in here, we need to understand the greatest hits of everybody, right? And Friedlander is one that you need to understand. And then the other really big one to me is Milton Friedman.
The free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
40 years ago, PBS, of all networks, gave the libertarian economist Milton Friedman hours in primetime for Free to Choose, an unapologetic take on why capitalism was morally and pragmatically superior to socialism. Over the course of 10 hour-long episodes, the Nobel Prize winner laid out the pitfalls of protectionism.
As consumers buying in an international market, the more unfair the competition, the better.
Espoused the virtues of school choice.
How do you explain the fact that there is no area of the free market, no area of the private market, in which the poor people who live in the ghettos of our major cities are as disadvantaged as they are with respect to the kind of schooling they can get.
And explained why spending, not taxes, was the real measure of the burden that governments put on their citizens.
If Congress spends $50 billion more than it takes in, if government spends $50 billion, who do you suppose pays that $50 billion?
Of course.
The Arab sheiks aren't paying it. Santa Claus isn't paying it. The Tooth Fairy isn't paying it.
In an era long before the web and YouTube democratized discourse, Friedman showcased an assortment of radical thinkers such as economist Walter Williams.
The minimum wage law has the effects of saying that if you cannot produce $2.90 worth of goods an hour, you don't deserve a job.
And Thomas Sowell.
To ascribe any status to any group of people, equality, inferiority, superiority, must necessarily reduce freedom.
And he subjected leading left-wing intellectuals like Democratic Socialist Michael Harrington, Teachers Union leader Albert Schenker, and political scientist Francis Fox Pivens to withering criticism of their ideas.
You've got to compare something with something. Will you tell me the alternative, which has improved the lot of the ordinary people? What is the system which, in your mind, has been successful? Most people through most history have lived in tyranny and misery. It's only a very tiny minority at any time that have been able to escape from it.
Free to Choose has been translated into 24 languages, and a companion book co-authored by Milton and his wife Rose was a New York Times bestseller and a Book of the Month Club selection. The series was a response to The Age of Uncertainty, a 1977 PBS series hosted by Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, a former ambassador to India who was a leading spokesman for big government liberalism.
Age of Uncertainty was an attempt to begin to use storytelling as a way to reach people. But it was a dismal failure because Galbraith was terrible. The TV series just disappeared. But it's not like Free to Choose, which is just everywhere 40 years later.
The visionary producer behind Free to Choose was Robert Chittister, a hardcore free marketer who ran the PBS affiliate in Erie, Pennsylvania, and wanted to bring libertarian ideas to mainstream audiences. Back then, he says, programs about capitalism and free enterprise were almost always relentlessly hostile.
They were really muckraking attacks on what was perceived to be abusive or unsympathetic free market capitalism, where profit was all that mattered.
In contrast, Free to Choose talked about capitalism in upbeat, positive terms, stressing how it helped individuals rather than exploited them, and how it brought about cooperation in a way that benefited the poor most of all.
One of the reasons why I am in favor of less government is because when you have more government, industrialists take it over, and the two together form a coalition against the ordinary worker and the ordinary consumer.
Chittister says that while the topic of each episode was sketched out ahead of time, Friedman's comments were unrehearsed and improvised. His favorite quote of the entire series comes in episode 5, when Friedman drew a distinction between equal opportunities and equal outcomes.
I don't think so. I haven't seen anything that he's done a 180 on. I guess it's possible. I mean, nobody, like, part of this journey on this rock through the fucking space cosmos is being able to change your mind when you're presented with new information. Maybe he saw some new shit and changed his mind. Maybe if Milton was still alive today, he would have changed his mind, but I don't think so. The Statue of Liberty is a female. She's based on the goddess Libertas from ancient Rome. I don't know. Not sure. Unknown.
Promote free. If you remove
I don't pay attention to French
stuff, open the way for people to use their resources, you will end up, in my opinion, and I think the empirical evidence is overwhelmingly on this side, you will end up with both more freedom, more prosperity, and more equality.
But did Friedman make any mistakes in Free to Choose? His celebration of the free market miracle in Hong Kong is poignant to watch at the moment that city's freedoms are under siege. And before his death, Friedman came to question his famous axiom that economic freedom in autocracies such as China would give rise inevitably to political and cultural freedom.
Milton, in a discussion close to near the end of his life, indicated to me, he said, "Bob, but I made a mistake. I was wrong. You have to have the fourth element. You have to have rule of law. You have to have law that applies equally to everyone. And clearly that's what you see not happening in China.
At 83 and ailing from a long bout with cancer, Chittister is himself contemplating his own mortality and how American society has changed since Free to Choose aired 40 years ago. He's proud that the program remains popular online, but, like Friedman, feels its analysis is somewhat incomplete.
Power is really something we have to factor into our thinking. The desire of humans to tell other humans what to do. You couple that with equality, and boy, you've got a recipe for constant problems in defending a classical liberal society.
40 years later, Free to Choose, the program Bob Chittister created with Milton and Rose Friedman, remains a powerful source for optimism and hope about freedom and the future.
Our freedom is in jeopardy, but it by no means has been completely destroyed. And I believe that there is a strong enough component of freedom in our society that we will be able to preserve it, that we're going to turn this trend back, that we are going to cut government down to size, we're going to lay the groundwork for a resurgence of that diversity, which has been the real product of our free society.
So that's what it all comes down to, right? Comes down to capitalism versus socialism. You've heard the argument a million times, and we're not gonna debate. We can go down these rabbit holes and conspiracy theories and all this shit, but none of that shit really matters. And we have here, this is the Soho Forum debate, and this is great because again, they bring in speakers that do both sides of the issue, and I think it's pretty remarkable.
Rival in consumption.
Hold on, here we go.
Economies, money, banking.
There we go.
Well, the main event begins. The resolution again, replacing the Federal Reserve with free market institutions would significantly improve the economy's money, banking, and financial systems. Arguing for the affirmative, Professor Lawrence White. Lawrence, please come to the stage. Arguing the negative. Columbia University Professor of Banking and Financial Institutions, Frederick Mishkin. Frederick, please come to the stage. Professor White, you have 17 and a half minutes maximum to make your case. Please take it away.
Okay. So the resolution is that replacing the Federal Reserve with free market institutions would significantly improve the economy's money, banking, and financial systems. Nothing requires that money be produced by governments. Money, like a loaf of bread or like a cell phone, is what economists call a private good. Its use is rival in consumption. If I'm using some money, other people can't use it at the same time, and it's excludable. The money in my bank account is not available to other people. And so there's goods that fail to meet those criteria are sort of the standard case for rationalizing government provision because they make it difficult to charge users on a user pays basis. But money doesn't have those characteristics, so there's no prima facie reason to expect the market to fail to produce money of the kind that people want to hold. And of course, we still do have lots of private money in our economy. Commercial banks issue checking accounts, that's private money. Paper currency is still privately produced in a few places in the world. And if we delve into the past, even coins have been privately produced. And if we delve into the future, we have cryptocurrencies. So it seems to me the burden of proof ought to be on those who want to nationalize the provision of money. But I understand that the status quo is what it is. The supply of basic money is controlled by governments. And so the burden, in practical terms, is on me to make a case that the provision of money by the private sector is not only feasible, but preferable. So that's what I want to argue, that we'd be better off if we allowed free market alternatives to replace the Federal Reserve System and the panoply of bank regulations. I'm going to focus on a particular version of free market money. I'm going to focus on a gold standard with a free banking system because it has the best historical evidence. I consider a Bitcoin standard possible but less likely because its purchasing power is more volatile, or would be more volatile even if it was the monetary standard. But if you think Bitcoin is the private sector money you support, please do vote for my side. Thank you. So in the kind of system I'm talking about, how would money behave under the influence of market forces? Too few economists even study this question. I took a look at Professor Mishkin's market-leading money and banking textbook. Doesn't discuss the topic of why we have central banks or what the alternatives are or whether the alternatives would be better. The status quo, and this is true in other textbooks as well, is taken for granted, and let's talk about how it works. But I'm kind of an oddball. I've been studying this issue for many years. I suppose that's why Gene asked me to take the affirmative side, but it's certainly why I accepted, because I think there's a pretty strong case. So I'm going to draw on historical examples that I've accumulated over the years. I'm going to talk more about money and banking than I am about finance. As a private good, money and banking have been privately and competitively produced through history in places where the state hasn't completely stamped it out. So money doesn't need a sovereign backer or issuer to have a market value. And this is contrary to a view known as the state theory of money, or sometimes as chartalism. There were no state insignias on the very earliest monies, on cowrie shells, on what anthropologists call hack silver, just pieces of silver that weren't in coin form. Silver and gold coins were privately produced before they were monopolized by the state, and even when they were produced by the state, they traded by weight, not by the insignia. People learned not to trust the insignia of the state as certifying the coin. In the 19th century, privately issued banknotes were the most popular kind of money. They were a bigger source of bank funding than deposits. So more than half of the money stock was privately issued banknotes. And as I mentioned, there have even been privately minted coins, and I'd like to talk about those because I published a paper last year in the Economic History Review, so look that up if you have access to JSTOR, about the successful record of private gold mints in the United States during the 3 gold rushes in U.S. history. Now, it's a complicated story, and there were some private mints that did a bad job. They were either incompetently run or they were run by scam artists who deliberately produced underweight coin. But the important thing is that those mints didn't survive. They didn't survive more than a few weeks. Once the word got out that a mint was producing underweight coins, nobody would bring them their gold to coin because those coins would not be easy to spend. The word was out. So the mints that succeeded and lasted were the ones producing high-quality coins and full-weight coins. And they produced significant volumes of coins, millions of dollars worth. So even that case can be handled by the private sector. Why did governments then choose to monopolize mints? Well, it goes back to ancient times. So
this is very important.
You shouldn't expect to find a public welfare reason for it. It wasn't to improve the quality of the coins, and in fact, ancient and medieval mints notoriously debased the coins. No, it was a source of revenue. Right? Call in the coins, remint them with half as much silver in each coin, and you've made a tidy profit for the sovereign. Similar story applies to why governments monopolized the issue of paper currency, not to improve its quality, not because there was any market failure, but because there was a fiscal aspect to it, a revenue potential from it. Looking into the near future, people are talking about a central bank digital currency, and I say, well, hold on. first make a case that the private sector can't produce digital currency efficiently, because we have Venmo. So why do we need a Fed version of Venmo? One concern people have about privately issued money, especially if the only thing they know about monetary history is the US in the early 19th century, is that there's going to be a confusing variety of monies trading at fluctuating values. But that's not actually the common experience. That was the experience in the US because we had laws against branch banking that made it impossible for banks to set up redemption agencies for their notes when they got out of the city where they were issued. They weren't allowed to branch across state lines. They couldn't set up redemption offices. There was the big exception, though, of the Suffolk system in New England, where a bank in Boston did arrange with other banks to accept their notes at par in Boston, and the system spread throughout New England. So there was an area where money did circulate, banknotes did circulate at full face value, 100 cents on the dollar, throughout the region. And that's what you find in other countries. Banks set up branch offices. There weren't any laws against them doing that. And so their money circulated at par throughout the country because it's in the interest of a bank to make sure its money circulates at par. They'll get more customers that way. And you could say the same thing is true about the private mints that survived. So in a freely evolved banking system based on this historical record, the definitive money was gold or silver coin. The unit of account was so much gold, so the dollar had a definition as so many ounces of pure silver, or later so many ounces of gold. The common money, though, was not coins. People didn't carry big bags of coins everywhere. They paid with bank-issued money. Banknotes, as I already mentioned, and merchants especially with checking accounts, all denominated in the gold dollar and all accepted widely at par. And of course, the technology for deposit transfer has advanced since the 19th century, but there's no reason we can't have phone transfers of gold-denominated money any more than fiat money, fiat-denominated money. So you see in these systems, only in the US, not only in New England, but also in Scotland and Canada and 50 more places. There's an article by Kurt Schuler which has a fairly complete list. Many issuers, all denominated in a common unit, widely accepted at par. All the banks are linked into a common clearing system, so they accept one another's liabilities, checks and banknotes, and then redeem them at the clearinghouse. And that keeps the system within check, but no central bank. Competition is generally better than monopoly, and the same is true in currency, and the same is true, I think we all take for granted, in deposit banking. If somebody said we should just have one deposit bank and it should be run by the government, you would say, well, they're going to be lousy on consumer service. But the same reasons that deposit banking should be competitive also apply to currency. And if you want a classic account of the argument, Adam Smith, book of Wealth of Nations, book 2, chapter 2, he makes 3 main points. It's better for customers to have competition for their business. They get better terms. If any one bank fails or makes some kind of money supply error, if it's only one bank out of 20, it's not of so much consequence than if it's the only bank of issue. And so that was the argument against giving the Bank of England an ever stronger monopoly in the issue of money in London. And then the third important thing about competition is that the banks check each other. The clearing system limits the danger of any large-scale overissue by presenting the bank that overissued with a big bunch of notes or checks to clear, and that means they lose reserves, and that's their signal that they've overissued. And it's a prompt signal, that's the important thing. So the quantity of money is limited to the quantity the public willingly will hold. Now, competition and the discipline of the clearinghouse still doesn't mean that no bank will ever fail. Adam Smith wrote about one spectacular failure during his day, the Ayr Bank, A-Y-R, but it's almost a play on words, because it was built on very shaky foundations. But importantly, its failure didn't bring down the other major note issuing banks because they knew not to be indebted to it. And so its failure didn't bring down the entire system. The system not only quickly recovered, but actually got stronger. So in Nassim Taleb's terminology, it wasn't a fragile banking system, it was an anti-fragile banking system. Other bankers took lessons from what the Air Bank had done wrong and stopped doing those kinds of things. So what you want in a banking system is anti-fragility. And
Thank you for the can gift, Maven.
Need a healthy variety, not every bank doing the same thing so that they can all end up doing the wrong
Hi, friends.
thing. It's one of the problems with today's regulatory system that we've fostered what you might call a monoculture of banking. All the large banks pretty much behave the same way because their regulators ask them to. So why do we have central banks? Let me quote what Alan Greenspan once told Jon Stewart, quote, "You don't need a central bank when we were on the gold standard, which was back in the 19th century, and all of the automatic things occurred because people would buy and sell gold and the market would do what the Fed does now," by which he meant the money supply would adjust to the demand for money. So the money supply is self-regulating under a gold standard. And of course, the US was on the gold standard when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So here's Alan Greenspan saying the US got a central bank that it didn't need. And the main impetus for the Federal Reserve Act was that there were financial panics, a series of financial panics, but they weren't inherent in competition and decentralization or even in being on the gold standard. And we know that because our neighbor to the north, Canada, had free banking, more free banking than the US. It had banks issuing the currency. It had a gold standard. It had an agricultural economy like the US. It had no panics. So we need to find a difference between the US and Canada to explain the difference in the fragility of the financial system. And it's not hard to find. There were legal restrictions on US banks that Canadian banks didn't have, namely the restriction of branching that I've already mentioned. But also there was a requirement that US banks couldn't issue more currency unless they had more collateral in the form of federal debt. And this scheme was started during the Civil War to market union government debt. But it sort of outlived its usefulness and became an important constraint so that when there was a seasonal demand for currency, the banks couldn't meet it, and that meant the banks lost reserves, and that's why there were financial panics. A lot of people at the time saw this and said, we ought to be more like Canada. We ought to deregulate our way back to stability. But the small bank lobby didn't want large banks branching into their neighborhoods, and so politically it didn't succeed. And of course, small banks blocked a lot of reform. We didn't get interstate branch banking in the US nationwide until the 1990s. So that's banking. Monetary policy, the Fed and other central banks, actually the Fed's not the worst of central banks, but the track record of monetary policy is not very good. It's pretty poor. If you compare fiat monies since 1971, that's when the Bretton Woods system ended and we got pure fiat money, we've had higher inflation than we had under the classical gold standard. We've had a less predictable price level. And you see that in the shrinkage of the market for 30 and 50-year bonds. They've become very rare because nobody knows what a dollar is going to be worth 30 years from now. Whereas under the gold standard, you got a pretty good idea what the dollar is going to be worth 30 years from now. It's often thought that, okay, we've got more inflation, but at least we've conquered the business cycle. No, I got bad news for you. We haven't conquered the business cycle. In an article with two co-authors, we measured the variance of real output in the US since 1971, and it's no lower. Output is no steadier today than it was during the period of the classical gold standard. So, I think a gold standard with free banking, I think there's evidence, would be better than the status quo. It would give us more stability of purchasing power. It would give us a sounder banking system. We wouldn't need too big to fail. We wouldn't need the moral hazard that comes with that. And it would give us sounder finance if we didn't have a central bank to issue things like the Greenspan put, which sort of opened the door to moral hazard in other financial intermediaries. How can we get there? Hopefully by, not by hyperinflation, which is how some countries have lost their fiat monies. Nobody hopes for that. But by reform, and I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I understand that. There's a long case of education to be made. But when we're ready for it, we'll be ready for free banking on a gold standard. Thank you.
Speaking for the America Federal Commission, take it away, Frederick.
Okay, so those were all a very plethora of reasons to not have the Federal Reserve in. Now we're going to hear the other side of it, and then these two will debate. If you have any questions, feel free to call in. Our call-in number's live. Shout out to a bunch of people. If you're joining us for the first time, we're actually broadcasting across many different platforms, and the support on a bunch of them is crazy. Shout out to people in D Live. That's really cool. We did take down Trovo because nobody was watching, but got listeners on Rumble. We got listeners on Pilled. We got listeners on Twitch. We got listeners on YouTube. I mean, it's pretty cool. So feel free to call in if you have any questions. We're here talking liberty. Probably going to make a format show around the afternoon sometime. We'll figure out how we're going to do all that shit. You know how it goes. Millions of plans, and then I go through on none of them type shit. So, normal bullshit as per always. Here we go. This guy wants the Federal Reserve intact. Boo!
So I feel a little bit like Daniel going to the Lion's Den, because I know the Soho Forum is a libertarian organization. So, one thing that was said earlier is actually the need for debate is so important nowadays. We're both in universities, and
shout out to Maven, thanks for the can.
I don't know what George Mason is like, but there really are a lot of topics that are extremely difficult to discuss in a rational way. It's very depressing sometimes. Because of my age, I actually teach, for example, about culture and economics. None of my junior colleagues will do so because they realize it could cause them a lot of problems. And for me, if it doesn't work out, I just retire. So it's not a big deal. So what I'd like to do first, because I'd like you to think about this as part of the debate, is I'd like to actually make some general comments about libertarianism. Okay? So I have read Atlas Shrugged. I've read Fountainhead. I love the books. Fantastic books. I enjoyed them thoroughly.
Those aren't... People need to stop saying Atlas Shrugged is a libertarian book. It's not. It's like a capitalist love novel. It's fucking gross.
But let me give you a perspective on where I stand. So if we take a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 is progressives like Bernie Sanders, let's put them at that end, and 10 would be the two Pauls, Ron and Rand Paul. Milton Friedman, I put probably about maybe 8.5, 9 kind of thing. I'd be about a 7. So I am somebody who's very pro-markets. And the issue that is critical, however, is that markets only work well if they have the right governance and certain characteristics. So markets in general are better, but on the other hand, there can be problems. And there are actually 3 kind of problems that you face in markets where they don't do the job very well. One is where they may not be able to have enough competition. So you can get monopolies developing, where in fact there's no competition. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I really strongly agree with, the key to getting an economy that's successful and actually getting life to be successful is competition. Actually, one of the things that people don't realize about universities is that we actually are very dog-eat-dog. We are always competing with others in American universities in terms of making our place more prestigious. And that's one of the reasons why U.S. universities dominate the world in terms of people wanting to come to universities. And I actually really like that. So one is that you want a market that actually will be competitive. The secondly is that markets can have problems if, in fact, information is not there. We call this asymmetric information in economics. Different parties have different information. Things can really get screwy in that case as well. So. What you think about this is you ask yourselves, and then the third is what we call externalities. The fact that you can do something that actually harms somebody else, and actually you're not able to compensate that person for it. By the way, there can be positive externalities. We usually worry about markets when they're negative. Where positive externalities, like, for example, research and development, is where you do something and in fact, it helps everybody else and you don't get paid for it. So those three things mean that markets sometimes don't work very well. And the key is getting the right institutions behind markets to get them to work very well. And in fact, this is something that I teach and talk a lot about in my courses, where I actually say, if you remember, the Gordon Gekko in Wall Street said, greed is good. Well, greed, in fact, generally is good if the markets are set up the right way, but greed can also be bad. And so that's, I think, a very important point. And there's a wonderful book by two University of Chicago economists, not exactly on the progressive side, to say the least, Luigi Zingales and Raghu Rajan. They have a wonderful title of the book. It's called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And what they do is they go into what problems that mean that markets frequently in developing countries have bad institutions behind them, and things as a result don't work out very well. And there's a classic example of this, by the way, which is what happened with the end of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union breaks up, communism's gone, and in fact there's a push, particularly by Western powers, to say, oh, we need to privatize and use markets to make things better. Well, what happened was, yes, we privatized, yes, there were markets, but in fact, what happened was that we got better and more capable monopolists taking over these markets, and it made things much, much worse. And that's actually what's going on right now. In fact, the war of Ukraine versus Russia is going to be one of the most important events in history, I think, because this is a battle not just about territory and, whether you're Ukrainians or Russians or whatever, and aggression. This is a battle of ideas. Whether Ukraine, which has moved from being very much like the Soviet Union or like Russia, and is trying to move towards the West, and I recommend very highly to you to watch the first season of Servant of the People, which is Zelensky's show, which talks about all these, trying to change. It's very funny, and how they're trying to move from this corrupt, the military is just like the Russian military, how to move it from there to something that's much better. So let me actually now get to the issue. So I hope that stimulates some of your thinking about libertarianism, because I know where the group that I'm coming in. Luckily, when you do this, who wins the debate, I got a shot because you had to vote first, and then you get to vote again. So the question is, should we replace the Fed by free markets? That's really the issue. And in fact, there are many things that I actually agree with that you've said in this context, that Larry has said in this context. He talked about competition. He also talked about the fact that money can be private. It doesn't have to be done by government. I agree completely with those issues. The real issue, as I'm going to argue, is will the economy perform better with a Fed or without a Fed? That's really the issue. And so I want to talk about that. And when you think about how you set up a system where you don't have a central bank, you have to tie money to something. So in fact, Larry talked a lot about the gold standard. I think it was good that he said, a lot of people talk about crypto. Libertarians frequently love crypto. The best thing about crypto was the Larry David commercial during the Super Bowl. That to me was, but crypto is really not something that would be suitable. It actually is designed to be very much like gold. It has to be mined so that, in fact, it's something that restrains the total production of it with real factors, in this case, using up a lot of electricity and servers. But clearly, crypto has such wild fluctuations in value relative to other prices that if you actually tied to crypto, you'd get incredible fluctuations in the price level, which would be very, very damaging. And then, of course, there are all the issues about, is crypto really secure? Is it safe? The brokerages. I think after FTX, the crypto boom in that regard is over. So I think the issue is we really do want to talk about the gold standard, because I think that is a case of where we did have a private money type system, and it actually functioned. There's no question that it could function. So here's, I think, the good news and the bad news about a commodity standard like the gold standard, or if you do silver or whatever. What is the good news? The good news is that if you take very long horizons, and Larry mentioned 30 years, then in fact you do get a stable price level. So for example, if you look at the price level when the American Revolution occurred, and then look 100 years later, it's very similar. So you don't tend to get these big trends, which we've had in terms of actually a price level which inflated very much over time. So that's the good news. The bad news is, as John Maynard Keynes says, in the long run, we're all dead. That's not the horizon that, in fact, most people are functioning in. They're functioning on much shorter horizons. What they really care about is what are the prices going to be next year, even sometimes next 3 months, but what are prices going to be like in the next year? When you actually look at the data, and in fact, there's a very well-known paper by Anna Schwartz, who, I don't know where we put her on the scale, but she's up there with Milton Friedman. And Anna, by the way, who's a wonderful scholar, a wonderful person. We all miss her. By the way, one of the feistiest people you've ever met. I would go to conferences with her. Somebody would say something, and she would just rip them apart. She was fantastic. I loved her. And she was also a nice Jewish grandmother, too, which is, again, a plus from my perspective. But she wrote this paper and looked at actually the performance during the gold standard. And what you see is, and it's not surprising, that because gold is produced and you can have discoveries and so forth, or all of a sudden the demand for gold changes because it can be used more for certain purposes, that what you find is that, in fact, the price level had much more fluctuations under the gold standards when you take the shorter horizon. But I think that's what's relevant in terms of thinking about how the world works. The second issue is that when you look in the US, and in fact, I do think that Larry's right, that there were issues of design of the system, that you did have financial crises and financial panics that were very, very frequent. And in fact, I'm going to argue that if a Fed knows what it's doing, if the central bank knows what it's doing, it improves tremendously on that. But it sometimes doesn't know what it's doing. So the classic example of this is the Great Depression, where the Fed was a new organization. Because of internal politics, it's really fun. If you had a lot of time, I tell you about all, one of the things you learn when you manage people, if you basically tell people what to do, frequently they act like teenagers who just do the opposite. Those kind of tensions occurred in the Federal Reserve System. And as a result, when we started to get the first set of banking failures towards the end of 1930, in the fall of 1930, the Fed absolutely did not. It was like Nero fiddling while Rome burned. It was a disaster. Now, you might say, well, that can keep on happening, but we learned our lessons. In fact, there's a wonderful speech that Ben Bernanke gave. He was a governor at the time of the Federal Reserve. He was not the chair. And it was Milton Friedman's 90th birthday. And Ben gave a speech where he talked about this very famous, brilliant, fantastic work, which I recommend highly to you. It's fun. It even has a little sex, drugs, and rock and roll in it, too, but it's scholarly about what was going on during the Great Depression. But Ben said, Milton, it's your 90th birthday, you're a great man. He said, about the Fed, you were absolutely right. They screwed up. But we've learned how not to do that again, and it's not going to happen. And then we had Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Fed. And of course, I was there with him as a governor. And as a result, we did not have a disaster with the global financial crisis. So I'd like you to think about what might happen or what the world might look like if we didn't have a central bank to basically do lender of last resort operations. They did it, by the way, in 1987 under Greenspan. Very, very important. It's not a well-known example, but in fact, there was a potential for everything to fall apart when the stock market fell by 20% in one day. That the Fed then actually took steps, very controversial. There were a lot of mistakes made, by the way. The Fed took 16 months really to get the plan implemented properly. When I was a governor, I was actually at one point wanted to dissent because I felt that we were not doing our job properly, that we were getting behind the curve. But nonetheless, the Fed was able to stop a depression from occurring. And we got closer than people realize. It was the scariest time that I've ever experienced as an economist. But let's look at, but in that case, you might say, well, this is because of all the incentives from regulation, the moral hazard that Larry mentioned. That's why this happened. But let's take a look at COVID. So the COVID pandemic is really a classic act of God, okay? That anybody says you can predict it. Yeah, we might do the pandemics. I just finished watching this terrible series that I really loved called The Last Ship. It was done in 2010 or something like that, and it's all about a world pandemic. We've talked about that. But really, this was a pure act of God. And in fact, if you look at understand financial crises, and let me tout my own work, I've done a lot of work on financial crises. My textbook talks about this a lot. There's a way of understanding the dynamics of financial crises. You look at what happened with the COVID pandemic, and it looked like boy, could have it sent us into a financial crisis and a depression. It actually had much less impact than the GFC, or the global financial crisis. In fact, the reason was, and we got very lucky, because if COVID had happened before the global financial crisis, I think we would have had a disaster. Because what happened during the COVID pandemic was that within 2 weeks of announcing the pandemic, and that was pretty quick. It wasn't just that we thought about it. I remember I was ready to go on a trip and didn't think anything of it, and then 5 days later, the WHO declared a pandemic. That the Fed basically did in 2 weeks what it took them 16 months to do. And that's because there was learning by doing. They learned how to handle it. In fact, I'm even going to give credit to our politicians, because I don't want to start talking about this. My head will start to blow off. The partisanship is so awful right now, but in a partisan world, they actually passed legislation to pump a lot of money into the economy when it was needed. It was extraordinary that it was done as fast as it was, even though they still all hate each other's guts. So it was really an extraordinary period that thinking about what the world would have been like if, in fact, we didn't have a Federal Reserve when the COVID pandemic hit is just absolutely incredibly scary. So let me conclude by saying that the bottom line is, I think that one of the worst ideas, now I'm not thinking that libertarianism in general, because I think there are a lot of points about libertarianism that you can see that I think are appropriate. And the reason why I think that people are attracted to libertarianism is that people who think that the government should do everything, progressives. I have a colleague, Joe Stiglitz. He did this wonderful research on why markets fail. He never, ever worries about the fact that governments fail. And that's really important. And that's why I end up being pretty pro-market, because even if there's a market failure, you have to ask yourself, if we put in this regulation, is it going to make it better? And sometimes it doesn't. And we've all had to deal with this kind of issues of crazy regulation. Actually was the commodore of a boat club that a barge came down from the Mario Cuomo Bridge, destroyed our pier, and we can't rebuild it because we have, well, finally we might, because we had a nightmare bureaucrat who, from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, who reminded me of the bureaucrat in Ghostbusters, the first one. Remember that bureaucrat? Lets all the ghosts out. So we really have to take that balance, and I think that's why we need to debate these issues. But to be very frank, I think the idea that we would want to abolish central banks and to replace them with something like a gold standard and free markets, I have to tell you, I think it's one of the worst ideas possible. It would be a scary world. Thank God, my view is that that's not going to happen.
Seven and a half minutes for rebuttal. Take it away, Larry.
Thank you for those remarks.
No, he's not joking. He's a Federalist. Like, the whole point of this Soho Forum, Curious Patriot, is to have everybody represent their side of this debate. And this is the Soho Forum. They do this every year. It's a Mises Caucus event as well. But they do capitalism versus different forms of capitalism. For this particular debate is about whether or not to end the Federal Reserve. That guy was a Federalist who was talking in favor of it. The guy who's rebuttaling now is talking in favor of the free market. Also, thanks for coming. Don't forget to thumbs up or red pill or whatever.
Professor Mishkin's main argument against the resolution is that we need a central bank, we need the Federal Reserve to ensure economic and financial stability. And let me reemphasize something I said earlier. In the study I did with George Selgin and Bill Lestraps, it was in the Journal of Macroeconomics in 2012, we found that real stability in the economy hasn't been any greater under the Federal Reserve, even if we confine ourselves to post-1971. True, they screwed up in the Great Depression, and so if you add that in, then the Fed's track record is even worse than the classical gold standard in terms of output stability. But even if you say, we're not going to count that, it was just practice. The Fed was still learning. Even if you just take a more recent period, the track record at stabilizing output is not greater. Okay, well, let's focus on financial stability in particular. It's often thought that the Fed is necessary to supervise and regulate banks and to serve as a banker's bank. But those were all functions that were performed by commercial bank clearinghouse associations. And they had better incentives to get the regulations right. That is, banks that were member of the clearinghouse wanted assurance that the other banks whose liabilities they were accepting were not going to default at the end of the day. So they wanted the other banks to be solvent, and they wanted some assurance that they were solvent. So clearinghouses demanded minimum capital, they demanded to see the balance sheet, and they actually demanded to audit the balance
hold on,
sheet.
we got some questions here in chat. Magic Chef says, when did we go off the gold standard and why? We went off in like the 70s under Nixon, and it was to curb inflation. Let me get the actual date for you. 1971, and yeah, to curb inflation was their official reason. And then Gerald Ford made it legal for us to own gold again. Is that what when the Federal Reserve was created? No, the Federal Reserve. I just want to make sure I get you correct information. The Federal Reserve was created December 23rd, 1913. And it didn't really do so good. It was particularly in response to the severe bank panic of 1907, which resulted in bank runs that wreaked havoc on the fragile banking system and ultimately led Congress in 1913 to write the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve System was initially created to address these banking panics. The main thing is that it stabilized our economy, but also fucked it up. I don't know. It's garbage. Like you have an ebb and flow in economies. It's just how it works. And the Federal Reserve likes to use Keynesian economics and Chicago School of Economics to borrow when they need to, but never pay back. So it's like a funnel without a bottom. It's just garbage.
Of their member banks. So an appropriate amount of that kind of regulation is undertaken in the private sector. The clearinghouses, of course, wouldn't impose regulations that were against the interests of the banks or against the interests of consumers unless they could organize a cartel, but there's no evidence that they were successful in doing that. It's often thought that the Fed is needed to backstop the financial system
Woodrow Wilson
in the event
is the president in 1913.
Bad happenings, panics, natural disasters, pandemics.
Yeah, Curious Patriot, no, 1913.
Somebody there
correct.
to make the printing press go burr, that there's going to be a lack of confidence that everybody
He just
can
referenced
get their
a
money,
Remy song. That's
when
awesome.
They want it. But in practice, a banking system without a central bank actually provides
no,
better
Wilson is
incentives
not
for
the worst
banks
ever.
to
The
act
worst
with-
ever is probably Buchanan, followed by George W. Bush because of the Patriot Act.
More restraint, to act with more prudence. That's an absence of moral hazard. I referred to the moral hazard problem earlier. And it's not just from too big to fail, it's from encouraging banks not to be adequately liquid. Probably the biggest piece of evidence I can offer in this regard is that the Canadian banking system, which had no central bank, which had no deposit insurance, weathered the Great Depression without a single bank failure. The economy went down, sure. I mean, the economy suffered because the U.S. is their biggest trading partner, so they could hardly have not had a depression in output, but they had no financial trouble. They didn't have any bank failures. Or we can compare the Scottish banking system during the heyday of the free banking period to what was happening in England, where the Bank of England was, well, people were encouraging it to act as a lender of last resort. I guess I should admit they didn't actually do very much last resort lending. But in a competitive system, if one bank overexpands, the other banks will discipline it by draining it of reserves. And that helps ensure stability of each bank, stability of the banking system, and actually stability of overall spending in the economy. The problem with a lender of last resort, again, is a moral hazard problem. In a sense, it underprices the assurance that it's giving, and thereby creates an incentive in banks to take on bigger risks than they would if they were bearing all the costs themselves. Let me finish with since I quoted Alan Greenspan earlier, with a quote from Paul Volcker. So after he had served as chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker was invited back to the Federal Reserve of Kansas City's annual conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Jackson Hole, Wyoming is a pretty expensive place. I wonder how they afford it. But here's what Volcker said, quote, this was on a panel on the role of the central bank. He says, quote, "If you say a central bank is essential to a market economy, I have to ask you about Hong Kong, which has no central bank at all, and is the absolute epitome of a free market economy. Yet it does quite well in terms of economic growth and stability." And I think Hong Kong is not an outlier here. If you look more broadly at the history of banking systems, you'll find that the ones that were least restricted exhibit greater stability, because on net, bank regulation has been more of a source of instability than of stability. Thank you.
Seven minutes of rebuttal from Professor Mishkin. Take it away.
Here comes our Federalist.
So let me talk about several issues here. So first of all, let's talk about this issue about how well the Fed has done since 1971. And I think it's clear that the great inflation was also a very, very bad period of monetary policy. So here's something I'm going to be patting myself on the back and academia on the back on this. One of the issues is whether the technology of central banking can get better or not. And indeed, there was a huge change in terms of research in macroeconomics. It's called the rational expectations revolution. Bob Lucas, one of the really important players in this regard, at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that we learned is we learned the importance of credibility and the nominal anchor. So that you actually have to have a nominal anchor. And you could use the gold as a nominal anchor, by the way. That's a possibility. But in fact, what people started to understand was that, in fact, if you have a strong nominal anchor, something like an inflation target, that you can actually get much, much better performance. And in fact, that was exactly what eventually was adopted. It took a long time. There was shades of it. There was inflation targeting light. When I was at the Federal Reserve Board, I was pushing for this quite hard internally, but couldn't talk about it till I was ready to leave. And I left in 2008, and then it only took another 4 years before the Fed implemented it, even though it was really pretty obvious that they had to go in that direction. And in that sense, we've actually had a much better monetary policy. Indeed, we talk about this period in economics, profession talks about it as the Great Moderation. It was interfered with by the global financial crisis, and that's a separate issue of these tremendous shocks that really have non-monetary elements, but can create huge problems. So one of the questions is, yes, the Fed did make mistakes in the past, but on the other hand, science has helped. There's something called the science of monetary policy. It's a little arrogant because there's no such thing as economic science like there is in biology, where there is in something like physics or whatever. But we've really come a long way, and I think that's really very important in terms of thinking about this. The other issue is to talk about these issues of regulation, which I think are very important. And I do agree with Larry that the clearinghouse associations actually did have better incentives frequently than government. And that's one of the reasons we actually like markets, because we think frequently that the pursuit of private profits or whatever can actually produce more efficiency and better incentives. And I think actually he's right that I should tell you that all my years spending at the Fed, I spent 5 years in FOMC meetings, 3 when I was an executive vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and then 2 when I got to actually sit at the table when I was a governor. Although I never ever felt that politics influenced a monetary policy, I can't say that about regulation. And so the government, and it's sort of obvious why, because monetary policy affects everybody very broadly. Regulation affects particular institutions, and boy, do they lobby like crazy. And it's amazing what some of these guys can get away with. I'm still mad at Kristen Sinema because the carried interest is an abomination. It's outrageous. If you don't know what this is, it's basically that you allow private equity firms to charge fees and then declare that they're capital gains and pay half the taxes. This is just, and yet she blocked it single-handedly. Well, I don't know if this is true, but somebody lobbied her, gave a few shekels here. Something happened. So we know that this can be an issue. There's one really huge problem. So I would actually agree with Larry that I think actually that clearinghouses, because the banks themselves, they do regulate, by the way. There's a lot of regulation in the clearinghouse associations that was done. Not now because they don't have to do it, but they did a lot of regulation. Their incentives were better. The big problem is that they can't create liquidity out of thin air. They don't have this ability to do the lender of last resort. That's the real issue. So I don't agree with him on I don't disagree with him on the view of incentives, but the bottom line is that they just don't have the machinery to solve a problem when a big enough shock hits. Small shocks, by the way, they do a fairly good job. The big shocks are what we're really worried about. And by the way, that's why the Federal Reserve was created. Because remember that there was a banking panic in 1907, one of the huge panics, and we had a depression as a result. They had a national banking commission. The person who helped bail out the system was J.P. Morgan. He had $1 zillion, but he didn't have the multi-zillion dollars he needed to create basically infinite liquidity. And so that's the problem that I have. The last thing I want to say is, referring to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, he's absolutely right that Hong Kong does not have a monetary authority doesn't do monetary policy. All it does is it does do some regulatory stuff, that they do not have a central bank of the type that other countries have. The reason they can do that is they're a small entity. They basically tie their currency, the Hong Kong, whatever it's called, Hong Kong dollar, yeah, that's why I'm having trouble, the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar. And that would be great. If you're a small country, you do not need to have a central bank, and you could have arguments why you might not need to have a central bank. So I have no problem with that. The problem is that we are the big gorilla in the room. In fact, whatever the US does affects everybody else in the world. We're seeing it right now. The Fed, by the way, made some very serious mistakes. I don't know if I'm on CNBC every time there's an FOMC meeting. Since April of 2021, I've been saying the Fed has a flawed policy framework. They're going to get in trouble. I then had an op-ed in the Financial Times saying that they really have their head up their tuchus, to be a little bit of a New York term. But I will say the following. It's not been a disaster. It didn't lead to disaster. It led to a very difficult situation. What the Fed has done, though, is they actually got it in terms of understanding that they had to commit to keep inflation stable and the inflation target. And they turned the super, usually they're very slow to turn the super tank around. Now it was a powerboat. So again, I think this is, again, some of the learning because of the literature, which, as I say, I have been a contributor to it on rational expectations and how to think about monetary policy, that the technology actually has worked. Are we going to suffer a little bit because the Fed screwed up? Absolutely, but not all that much. That doesn't mean we're going to have a recession. Some bad things, but I'm talking not that bad. So in conclusion, I just have to strongly disagree with Larry on this.
Thanks to you both. We now come to the Q&A portion of the evening. There is a microphone over there.
Okay, and that's kind of where we're gonna leave it. Maybe we'll do the Q&A stuff on a different episode. Maybe not. Who knows? This was mainly just a test for the concept of it. You gotta just really be out there enjoying it. I wanted to see how good and receptive any of the streams are, how well we could do having Pilled in here instead of Trovo. The answer was pretty good. There wasn't a lot of buffering. Oh. There. And Rumble, thank you guys for the Rumbles. That's super dope. I don't know what the fuck's happening in D Live. He literally didn't even say anything but talked and made me wonder if I'm stupid. Yeah, he did. He actually said a lot. That should upset you if you think he didn't say anything. It might be the latter part that you're wondering. Sorry. And what up, pilled people? Curtis Versus with the thing. He said a lot of things with substance. You should go back and re-listen. You might not have comprehended it, but there's a lot of substance, especially in that last part. That first part, there was a lot of filler for sure. But that second rebuttal, he actually said quite a bit. Stabilizing economies, macroeconomics that are available now that weren't available when anybody was analyzing the micros. Lots of stuff. I got here. What's the TLR what's the too long didn't read version? It's like this. People have different opinions on how the economy should work. Yeah. And that's okay. Because as a libertarian, everybody gets to be an individual, right? Part of being a libertarian is being lonely because you're out on an island by yourself. That's fine. Fuck it. We don't need anything. We'll be on this goddamn island. I don't give a shit. Let's do it. What? Don't forget to not buy Hogwarts Legacy because people are boycotting it because of that chick's like transphobia, I guess. Is that what happened? I don't fucking know. Fuck your money. Ducats, boys. Yeah, get some ducats going. Yeah, you gonna get some ducats? You gonna duck out with some ducats? Some duckies? Duckies. Got them chicken ducats? All right. We out. Before we go, remember, if you're looking for more content like this, we do a show every Monday through Friday called Twitch Talk. It's over on Twitch. There you go. Twitch.tv/CoreyAdamComedy. If you're watching on Twitch Talkcast, you can probably hold tight too. I'm probably going to just go play some UFC. I can't really leave my house today because everything's fucking snowmageddon outside, I guess. You're so fucking stupid, man. So dumb. There you go. Yeah, give that Twitch channel a follow. Like I said, we do it Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. right over there. Otherwise, we do random streams all over. Corey Adam Comedy. You can go to allmylinks.com/Corey Adam Comedy. We got a Discord. We got all kinds of stuff, man. But come hang out and have fun. Tell me why being a libertarian is stupid. Because you can't. You can try. But it ain't going to go so well for you. All right. Peace out. Oh yeah, and special thanks to Curious Patriot, Maven, W. Kirby, and Carrie Lake, all giving the old thumbs up over there. Thank you so much. Goodbye.